Greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young, and I am a member of the Committee 100, and I happen to be the chair of the Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings initiative that we started about 3 years ago. I think when we first started, we knew there was a big problem and good to have a platform to allow experts to talk about the research they're doing, or people who are in business talk about the aspects in their side of the business, or families talking about how the family issue and the Asian way of raising kids. And it's been wonderful. We've had attendance of anywhere from 100 to 700 people for each of these. All of these are recorded and they are available on the Committee 100 website. It's also available so that Jackie can binge watch and watch himself over again, or his family and friends, right? We'll continue doing this as long as it serves a useful function. But we are starting to move towards trying to get the various groups to work together and collaborate and to focus on solutions, not just illuminating why there is a problem. Before I introduce our three panelists today, I happen to be on the board of the Committee 100, and I'm also the chair of the next annual conference in Gala, which is going to be on April 19th. It's going to be very exciting. It's going to have a whole variety of speakers talking about various issues, including the career ceilings issues. We'll have speakers both on domestic issues, on defending Asian American, Chinese American rights, but also on how to create better understanding between the U.S. and China. We have Ambassador Nicholas Byrne, who will be speaking. We have four of the previous ambassadors to the U.S. on a panel talking about their perspectives. We have people talking about the Texas land laws and the technology competition between the U.S. and China. So I encourage all of you to attend. Again, it's a conference followed by a gala. You can choose one or the other or both, and it's on April 19th. And registration is open up. The last thing I'll say is that our next Asian American Career Ceilings webcast will be on, I believe, February 8th. That date might change. And it's going to be on journalism and the news. So we're going to have a panel, Asian Americans who are in journalism and writing, reporters, and also broadcast and news anchors. And they're going to share what really is a real problem in journalism and the news and broadcast. So I encourage you to watch that if you're interested in that area. Last thing I want to say is we're going to conduct this as kind of a fireside chat. I'll introduce the speakers, but I have a series of questions that I'll be posing to them. And we're going to make sure, though, that we have time at the end for questions from the audience. Essentially, the best way for you to ask a question is to write it into the chat box or the Q&A box. And all of the panelists will be able to see it, and we'll try to answer as many that we can. I get to start out in saying this topic is a very important topic because it's not just whether you get promoted. It's also an issue whether you're paid fairly for what you do. I guess you'll hear from these experts the extent to which the pay issue is a problem or not. We certainly know the promotion issue is an issue, and that is repeated over and over for most industries that we know. So I'm going to start out, ask each of you, why do you personally have felt that you care about this issue? So Kweilin, if you want to start.
Yeah, I think this topic is critically important to me, both because of the promotion gap that you describe, the pay gap, but especially the gender gap, right? So for every two men who are promoted, Asian and Asian American men who are promoted, only one woman is. And that gender gap is a bit of a double whammy for Asian and Asian American women in the workplace.
Professor Liu?
Sure, thank you, Peter. I would say it's critically important because the common assumption is that Asian Americans are already doing fine, right? At least in terms of education. Maybe there's some awareness that they experience a bamboo ceiling in leadership, but the assumption is that at least they're well paid, right? So they really shouldn't complain much. But as you will see today, my research actually demonstrates some striking gaps and potentially a bamboo ceiling salary. So I think it's very important.
Jackie, your personal view?
I think the thing that's really important, based on the research that we've done, is the group that is Asian American and how varied it actually is based on the different ethnicities, based on the different backgrounds, whether you're a refugee immigrant or you're a skills forward kind of immigrant, right? Like there are just so many discrepancies and differences among that entire group, that it really is important for us to talk about that and how all of that actually changes the narrative on Asian Americans and the pay.
So let's jump right into it. Is there unfair pay and so forth? And I think all three of you, either through research your firm has done or the research that you've done, have some insights on it. So anyone can speak whatever they want or not speak. Is it really true that Asian Americans are paid less for equivalent work? And if so, how bad is it?
I'm happy to start by saying that, of course, all research is limited and, in terms of sampling and method, but a large amount of data and I would say increasing amount of research suggests that it's not just a yes or no question, right? So we have to think about the different dimensions. As Jackie alluded to, which group exactly are we talking about? Asian is a big monolithic group. And as I will share today, it really depends on which Asian subgroup we're talking about, right? For example, the difference between East Asians versus South Asians, as you will see, is actually quite striking. And in fact, when you just lump them together, you might actually not see the gap you would otherwise see. And also, I think it depends on the industry, right? Are we talking about consulting or investment banking, medical care, and so on? And finally, are we talking about, for example, Asian internationals versus Asian Americans, right? So all those factors produce a complex picture.
Is it true then for many professions they are underpaid, but some maybe it's the other way depending upon what group of Asian Americans they're part of? Is that basically your conclusion?
I would say it's also, when you say less paid, right, we have to think about relative to what. I would say what I will show you statistically is that relative to other factors, for example, controlling for the education background and so on, it appears that indeed East Asians are underpaid in certain industries.
Yeah, well, my definition, at least personally, is if two people are doing the same job,
right,
are they getting paid the same? That I have a simple way of looking at it. Kweilin and Jackie, I know you've commented on this on articles that you've co-authored, et cetera. Any comments?
The work that we've done has been on looking at occupations and how Asian Americans are distributed within different occupational groups as it is sort of as the data is out there from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And the thing that we do see is that if you look again as a group, Asian Americans are paid more than everybody else. If you disaggregate everything and look at the different occupations, you actually see what happens is the discrepancy is that Asian Americans in lower paying occupations tend to be paid more than their other races and their counterparts. Asian Americans in higher wage occupations tend to be paid lower. In fact, if you look at the top, I think 20 occupational groups in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, for each dollar that a white employee is paid, Asians are being paid at 93 cents. So that's kind of the discrepancy that we see. It's less around kind of, to your point, Peter, that if you're working in the same job, are you getting paid differently? It is in occupations, and this has a lot to do with management, leadership, and so forth, that Kweilin was talking about earlier in terms of promotion. That's the discrepancy that we see in our research.
I hope the takeaway is not that if you want to be paid more than other ethnicities, go work in a factory.
We'll get into that and why that is the case later on.
Oh, by the way, Jackson Liu and Michael Morris from Columbia, they did a joint study and showed that actually, in terms of just promotions, Indian Americans did well. And my takeaway at the end of the panel, as I said, the lesson here is get adopted by an Indian American family. That was the takeaway. So Kweilin, your view on this is maybe similar to Jackie's since you work together, but
yes, as we're co-authors. No, I agree. I think Asian and Asian Americans make up about 14% of those earning about $100,000 or more a year. And at that level, it is a 93 cents on the dollar pay gap. And so that is significant. We also see that Asian and Asian Americans at work report lower levels of sponsorship and inclusion. And so that's another challenge. That may be one of the drivers, right? If you don't have the sponsors creating the opportunities, pounding the table, supporting you when you do ask for a raise, or maybe you don't ask for a raise. That is a challenge and would widen that gap there. But that's the 93 cents on the dollar that's most concerning.
Okay, very good answers and very nuanced. So we're going to shift, and Professor Liu is going to show some slides.
So I'm excited to share some new research that just came out last year in a high impact management journal called the Journal of Applied Psychology. And here's the basic idea, right? As many of you have already alluded to, in the US, Asians are known as the model minority, right? So, and indeed, if you look at the societal level, they have the highest median income, even higher than white people. Therefore, one common assumption is that Asians are already doing fine. However, as Peter alluded to, I've been doing research which fundamentally challenges this assumption by revealing the neglected challenges experienced by some Asian groups in important domains, such as leadership attainment, starting salary, and even academic performance, right? So today we're going to talk very quickly about what I call a bamboo ceiling in starting salary. Now, a common problem in both research and practice is that most organizations and researchers will lump all Asians together when we think about Asians, inequality, and so on, right? Without really distinguishing and considering the differences, the cultural differences between the different Asian subgroups, for example, ethnic Chinese, ethnic Vietnamese, and ethnic Indian, which if you think about it, they're culturally different and also they even look very different. So the key proposition of this paper is that net of other factors, such as education, meaning after you statistically control for the other factors, East and Southeast Asians, but not South Asians, actually tend to start with low salary or lower salary, partly because they're less likely to negotiate. So why is this important, right? So if you think about it, when in business school, I teach negotiation, and negotiation 101 when we teach students is that, for example, in business, as in life, you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate, right? Whereas Gandhi famously said, if you don't ask, you don't get it. And indeed, a lot of research suggests that as an act of assertiveness, negotiation increases economic benefits. For example, one study found that individuals who chose to negotiate increased their starting salary by an average of $5,000, right? So if you don't negotiate, you lose that basically. Of course, sometimes when you do negotiate, you may not succeed, but if you don't negotiate, the increase will always be zero. So here, I draw on the cultural framework of honor versus face cultures, which, according to quantitative analysis, has identified, for example, honor cultures such as India, Pakistan, meaning South Asian cultures, along with other Middle Eastern cultures, to be called honor cultures, which tend to encourage individuals to act assertively and even aggressively. And the idea is that they really need to maintain their self-worth and gain honor. So that's a core cultural logic. By contrast, we see face cultures, which, for example, refer to China, Japan, Korea, and also Southeast Asian cultures such as Singapore, Vietnamese. And these face cultures really discourage assertiveness and confrontations. And in fact, assertiveness can make one lose face, right? So as exemplified by proverbs such as the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. And indeed, if you think about it, East and Southeast Asian cultures, also known as face cultures, they tend to discourage assertiveness, right? So here I emphasize what I call the 3H, the 3 hallmarks of face culture, which are humility, harmony, and hierarchy. And if we think about it as an act of assertiveness, salary negotiation threatens all 3 hallmarks of the face culture, right? In terms of harmony, salary negotiation by definition is a distributed negotiation with conflicting interests. As a higher salary for the employee naturally means more expenditure for the employer, right? So individuals from East Asian and Southeast Asian cultures, they may be concerned the salary negotiation will damage the relationship with their employer and therefore disrupt relational harmony. In terms of humility, salary negotiation can violate this value of humility, right? Because salary negotiation means that one feels entitled to ask for more than what has been offered. So individuals from East Asian, Southeast Asian cultures, they may be socialized to be humble and basically think, okay, I'm just gonna head down, do my work, let my work speak for itself. If I do that, surely I'll get promoted, I'll get a salary raise. And finally, salary negotiation can upset relational hierarchy, right? If you think about it, oftentimes job candidates, they're negotiating with higher status individuals. For example, the prospective managers or HR managers and so on, to whom they're supposed to defer. So therefore, East Asian, Southeast Asian culture individuals from these cultures, they may be more concerned that asking the mere act of asking may offend the hierarchical relationship, right? So given these concerns and cultural values, I hypothesize that net of other factors, East Asian and Southeast Asian, East and Southeast Asians, but not South Asians, they tend to have lower starting salary, partly because they're less likely to negotiate. In addition, in support of this theory and this mechanism of negotiation propensity, here I also consider industry negotiation norm, which will be an important boundary condition for the proposed differences. Because it's widely known that unlike firms in other industries, right, consulting firms offer standard and non-negotiable compensation packages, especially for MBA students. So therefore, it's actually normative for MBAs not to negotiate consulting offers. Right? So if that's the case, given such negotiation norm, therefore we should expect that, well, if MBAs usually they do not negotiate consulting salary job offers to start with, then the hypothesized cultural difference in negotiation propensity and salary outcome should only apply to non-consulting jobs. Right? So if that's the case, this will provide further evidence for my theoretical perspective. So to test my theoretical perspective, I conducted 2 large-scale studies. Due to time limit, I will quickly share the results from study 1, which basically was a 19-year MBA study of these MBA students who accepted job offers in the United States. Right? These are all real MBA students. To my knowledge, it's one of the largest studies on real salary negotiation outcomes. And also, this large data set allowed me to analyze industry norm, whether you're in the consulting industry versus not, as a boundary condition. So altogether, we had about 7,000 students in the sample, right? Real MBA students. And upon graduation, about 6,000 became company employees. So this is the group I'm focusing on, because the other groups, for example, those who started their own business and became founders, or who basically were obliged to return to the sponsoring companies, they basically are qualitatively or substantively different, right? So it may introduce the statistical confound if we analyze them. So I'll quickly show the results. What we see is, given the substantive difference between consultants and non-consultants, let me first show you the results for non-consultants, right? So first, let's just look at all Asians together, as most scholars and practitioners do. What we see is that without distinguishing East Asians, Southeast Asians from South Asians, we see that, well, this seems to be consistent with a model minority perception, which is that actually Asians on average, as a whole monolithic group, they had marginally higher starting salary than Latinos and Black people, right? And they were not significantly different from white and Middle Easterners. However, as hypothesized, a striking salary gap emerged once I distinguished between East Asians, Southeast Asians, and South Asians, where you can see in the graph, the Southeast Asians and East Asians, they actually had the lowest starting salary of all ethnic groups, where South Asians had the highest salary of all ethnicities, right? So once again, if we just lump them all together, we would have not observed this major striking gap. And this is just a descriptive statistic what I'm showing you. And now let's conduct a more complex analysis while controlling for important variables such as whether someone is international, their age, gender, whether they took a negotiation class, their GPA, and so on, right? You see that, for example, GPA indeed positively predicted the starting salary. What we see is that in model 3, which is the most conservative model with the largest number of control variables and so on, we see the estimated salary gap between East Asian, Southeast Asian, and South Asian is about $4,000, right? So what does this mean? To give you a more concrete example, if an East Asian person started at, let's say, 125,000, whereas a South Asian person started at 129,000, and if we assume a 3% annual salary increase, right, this would actually result in a cumulative difference of over 240,000 over a 35 career, which I would argue is a substantial amount of money, right? So just this initial starting salary. And to think about why this is happening, when we do analysis about negotiation propensity, indeed, we see that East and Southeast Asians, they were the least likely to negotiate, whereas South Asians actually, they had high negotiation propensity. And then when we conduct a mediation analysis, we see that negotiation propensity indeed mediated, in other words, partly explained the salary gap between East Asian versus South Asian, and also East Asian, Southeast Asian versus white students, right? So suggesting that part of the salary gap could be attributed to the negotiation propensity. In further support of the theory, we see that, again, these are still non-consultants, right? So among those who did not negotiate, we asked them, well, why did you not negotiate? And you can see a major difference between the three groups, where we see that East Asian and Southeast Asians, they were the most likely to say, well, I actually didn't want to damage the relationship. And that's why we did not negotiate, right? So far, I've shown you statistics for just the non-consultants. But what about consultants? So what we see is that for the consultants, as you would expect, right? Earlier I said, well, basically consulting firms tend to offer standard compensation package. And indeed, we basically don't see any ethnic difference across the group, right? And because the norm is that the compensation package is standard. And also because the norm is that no one negotiates or not many people negotiate, we also actually don't see any statistical difference among these groups in terms of negotiation propensity. So to summarize quickly, we see that the 90 MBA dataset provided real-world evidence from my theoretical perspective and uncovered interesting insights, right? So when I lumped East Asians, Southeast Asians, South Asians together, appeared that this large monolithic Asian group appeared to have high starting salaries, similarly high as white people, right? However, the striking gap emerged once I distinguished among the Asian subgroups, where South Asians started with the highest level of non-consulting salary of all ethnicities. East Asians and Southeast Asians were actually near the bottom. And in addition, right, we see that the initial gap was estimated to be about $4,000 a year for non-consulting jobs, which is substantial. And this is partly explained by East Asian, Southeast Asians' propensity to not negotiate. In addition, East Asian, Southeast Asians, they were more likely to cite relational concerns as a reason for not negotiating. And in addition, the salary gap was not observed for consulting jobs, where MBA starting salary are usually standard and non-negotiable. And I should also say that the results actually apply to both internationals and Americans, right? Suggesting that it's not just an issue of the English fluency and so on. For more details, you're more than welcome to read the research in detail, many pages, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And thank you.
Move on, but this is actually quite useful, and it does just look at the starting salary. So obviously it'll be interesting. I'm sure, Professor Liu, you'll do work on what happens over the different stages of your career.
Yes.
But this is very interesting and it seems to make intuitive sense, right? For those of us who know the difference between the personalities and styles of different groups. So let's move on. I mean, I think we're starting to move into the question of why, right? There's a gap, and Professor Liu has shown us for MBAs. But I guess I'd like to then speak more broadly and look at business and say, maybe we can, Kweilin and Jackie, you can say what appear to be some of the reasons beyond this negotiation thing, the issue that is causing certain groups, but not all Asian groups, not to do as well in terms of salaries.
I'll cite a couple. I do think this sponsorship gap that we hear from Asian and Asian Americans across the board, across all levels, but you could imagine that being increasingly important as you become more senior in the organization, and relationships, advocacy, kind of trust across a smaller and smaller group at senior levels becomes more important. I think that gap that we hear loud and clear from Asian and Asian American workers is a critical one, and one that would be highly correlated to this. I also think that in negotiation, it's important to look at gender differences and what we know about gendered negotiations. In fact, a few years ago in some of our Women in the Workplace research, there was a pretty significant gap, and Sheryl Sandberg wrote about it in her book, Lean In, between women and men advocating on behalf of themselves in jobs, exactly as you research, Jackson, for pay, certainly, but even for their title and other benefits. And after kind of a year of talking about this and the broader awareness, actually that gender gap closed significantly. But what we still see is when women do ask for higher pay, different title, or more benefits, they are much more likely to be perceived as pushy, bossy, self-centered, right? And that perception is both by men and women. And so there is also not just a racial component here, but a gendered component as well. And I would keep that in mind as we think about kind of that double whammy of promotion gaps that we talked about. It's true also in negotiations and perceptions of those who negotiate successfully or unsuccessfully on their own behalf.
Jackie, you have any comments about why there are situations where there's a disadvantage on salary?
Yeah, let me actually circle back to Kweilin's comment about sponsorship, because one thing that we did in our research was we disaggregated, again, kind of like what Professor Liu was saying, disaggregated among East Asian, Southeast Asian, South Asian folks in terms of sponsorship. And what we saw was perceptions of how effective sponsors were fairly even when it comes to white workers and South Asian workers, when it's entry-level workers versus managers. If you looked at East Asian and Southeast Asian workers, the discrepancy of sponsorship effectiveness at the entry level is not that different, right, between white workers, Southeast Asian workers, East Asian workers, South Asian workers. But once you get to the manager and senior manager level, the perception of the effectiveness of sponsorship drops significantly for East Asian and Southeast Asian workers. So that's another one of those things, right, that leads to this kind of discrepancy of sort of not having the promotions or not having the kind of opportunities that folks might have. And so the differences, even if you're at the same level, the differences in pay could be explained by the kinds of responsibilities that the same people at those same levels are getting.
And also, I think a point I want the audience to remember is that there are many factors. It's not just whether you're aggressive about asking more. You actually have to properly assess where you have leverage and where you don't have leverage. If you're in a situation where you don't have leverage, being extremely aggressive, so forth, may not have the outcome that you want. I think probably what's happened is a lot of Asian Americans across the board don't take advantage of where they do have leverage. In other words, where they have an advantage or they're better and demonstrably so. But I think the lesson is not to go out and be aggressive in all situations, because you got to start out with whether you have leverage and whether you have better performance or whether you're better than the people you're competing with, right, for salary increases. Let's turn to this issue of what can each individual do, but also what can we do to change the system systemically to make this unfairness issue go away? Because really it is a combination. It's what you do, but also the system that you're in. Any comments about, maybe let's just start out with, are there systemic things, not related to individual behavior, that are being done or should be done that would help to correct this problem?
I would start with tracking data at a much more granular level, right? As Jackson and Jackie both describe, if we don't have data at the sub-Asian population level, both by kind of race, but also by immigration kind of status, et cetera, we're not going to know more granular insights, and we're not going to understand individual groups who have kind of more significant pay gaps. So I think the first step is greater data and just understanding, as well as where are the pinch points across the talent pipeline? Where are we losing a disproportionate number of Asian and Asian Americans, cut by sub kind of race, but also by gender, as I described. Some of these patterns also significantly different for women versus men in Asian and Asian American populations. I also think beyond kind of tracking the data, closing some of these sponsorship gaps that we've been talking about, and that has an impact on the negotiations that Jackson was describing, that has an impact on creating opportunities. You can see those gaps across the organization, and closing those through sponsorship programs, both formal and informal, I think can make a significant difference.
Yeah, and also, sadly, later we're going to talk about the attack of DEI groups and so forth, but sadly, some of the things that have companies developed to help ethnic minorities in terms of how they manage themselves and their careers, they're being hammered. So that's a problem. Jackie or Professor Liu, any comments about systemic, not individual, but systemic solutions or problems that need to be overcome? Oh, he's raised his hand. I call on Professor Liu.
Oh, yes. So yeah, if I may chime in, I would say definitely there are systemic things to be done, right? So first, if we think about implications for society, I think to foster real inclusiveness, we need to understand the different challenges experienced by different ethnic groups in American society, right? So rather than just assuming that, oh, Asians, they're already the model minority, they're already doing fine, which may result in the challenges being overlooked, right? So rather than assuming they are always successful, I think it's important to be aware of the potential bamboo ceiling, starting salary, or leadership representation, and so on, right? And I think a few factors might have contributed to this neglect of the phenomenon, right? So first, I would say people in general, including, let's say, East Asian and Southeast Asians themselves, they might have overlooked the challenges in starting salary because, as I showed you earlier, Asians at the societal level, they have the highest average income, right? So they think they're already doing well. And second, in most governmental and organizational statistics, they lump all Asians together, which can actually obscure meaningful differences among these Asian subgroups.
And so it goes back to what Kweilin said, which is more refined data will be very helpful to understand the nature of the problem.
Yeah, as a social scientist, I'm always pro more data. And I think if you think about it, this bamboo ceiling wall experienced by East Asians, Southeast Asians, they may actually experience further economic challenges if they enter an organization with, let's say, lower salary, right? Than they might have earned through negotiation, because job salary is actually usually the basis for future salary increases and maybe other types of compensation, right? Your bonus, your pension, and so on. And also, job salary is often used as a cue for employee competence and ability and experience, right? So if I'm a new manager, I just started at the organization, I don't know these people, but I have a spreadsheet of these individual salary, I may naturally assume that employees with higher salaries are more competent, qualified, and experienced, right? As a result, I might actually allocate more responsibilities and opportunities to these employees. So therefore, these East Asian, Southeast Asians, they may be disadvantaged when, for example, in this organization, right, when interfacing new managers and so on. And similarly, they may be disadvantaged when they apply for new jobs that actually inquire about the salary history. I know some places prohibit that, right? So, but some places actually don't. And then, then these employers can actually afford to pay them less than they deserve. So in other words, this initial gap in starting salary could actually be the beginning of a vicious cycle. So I think for all those reasons, very important. Yeah.
Jackie, systemic problems and what could be changed. You've raised your hand. I call on you, right?
Raise my hand. I think one thing that's directly, maybe indirectly related to this entire conversation that's systemic is communication and social capital. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that we've seen a lot in research, both McKinsey research and outside academic research, that talks about how different groups kind of behave and operate differently in terms of how they communicate, the transparency of information that is shared. And oftentimes when you talk about underrepresented / underserved / marginalized, whatever term you want to use that's been used over the past 5 to 10 years, groups, right? Those groups are generally there because of a lack of communication and transparency of information that prevents them from understanding what opportunities are out there, or understanding, as Jackson was saying, what other people are earning in salaries, right? And so like they don't have, it's sort of that imperfect information that prevents them from actually knowing what they would, kind of deserve to be paid, and or what opportunities are out there to actually get them at higher levels and so forth, right? And so you can see that kind of different ways that, for example, South Asian groups behave with each other versus East Asian groups behave with each other, where there's sort of this, kind of scarcity mindset with East Asians that South Asians generally don't have. And so part of the thing to sort of break through some of these systemic challenges is, for groups that are less likely to be open and transparent in communication, for there to be more kind of paying it forward and helping of kind of folks that you know, and so on and so forth. And that changes the dynamics of what kinds of information is shared and what kinds of transparency there is for people who don't have.
Let's switch to individual actions. So we have a large group of people who are in attendance on this for this webcast. Let's try to give them some advice on the individual level as to what they can do to make sure that throughout their career, not just the start, but throughout their career, that they're paid fairly. I'll start off by saying one thing, and I think this is very similar to what Kweilin says: make sure you do your homework. Get some sense for what other people are getting paid within your company with similar skills and similar responsibilities, but also what may be true at other companies, that are in your industry. If you don't, you really have no way of. Now, it's obviously, I'm not saying then you throw numbers around to your boss, but if you're not well informed, it's hard for you to be an advocate for yourself if you don't know what the gap is. So, it doesn't mean that you should be disloyal to your company and always constantly threat to leave, but it really is very important to make sure that you know what the lay of the land is and how people are getting paid at your company and elsewhere in order for you to know, right, and to have the right kind of conversation with the people that you're working for. So let me turn to our three panelists. What advice, each one lesson as an individual, what the people in the audience could do to make sure they're fairly paid throughout their career?
There's so many things individuals can do, right? So I would start by saying, because Asians, they tend to have high educational achievements and professional qualification, right? CPA and so on. So it may be relatively easy for them to get a job in American society, right? So therefore, they may be just oblivious to the possibility they're actually being underpaid than what they could have been paid. So I think awareness is number one. And then I would say study negotiation, so I actually teach a course called, teach an MBA class called Power Negotiation at MIT. And I think there are a lot of negotiation materials that people can read on their own. I definitely agree with what Peter said in terms of, for example, knowing your band, right? Knowing your best alternative, growing your alternatives, and being well informed of what is the industry norm, right? So I think that can also be very helpful. And also I would say, don't focus necessarily purely on salary and think about other things. Can you ask your organizations to sponsor your, let's say, I'm just making this up, right? Driving class or your CFA and other things that could add value to your career. And in the process of doing so, don't frame it as a narcissistic, egocentric way, but rather frame it as, I want to contribute more value to our organization, and therefore I would like you to sponsor me for this and that. Or, if you purchase me a standing desk with 3 monitors, I can be more productive. I think framing is highly important.
Well, certainly, for example, how much money you make is a combination of whether you're paid the same for the same job, but also whether you get promoted. So if you combine the two, where you're not paid fairly for what you're doing, but then you don't get promoted, the effective gap becomes even larger. Kweilin, right. Do you have any advice to people on how to make sure they can be treated fairly?
In addition to what Jackson described on kind of advocating for yourself, negotiating on your own behalf, I would say invest systematically in building relationships, right? This closing your own sponsorship gap, both internally to the company, but you might also not be there forever. So I would say also externally to the company. Think of that as investing in yourself. And maybe it's 1-2 hours a week, right? Just a small percentage of your overall time. But building that network externally will make you more effective at your current job. It also creates a bit of a safety net and a broader network to pull upon should you jump. And then I would say, don't be averse to both making career jumps across companies and making bold and very different career jumps. We've done some other research on human capital, both in the United States and across 3 other countries globally. And those who make earlier jumps, as well as bigger jumps in terms of what we call skill distance, or difference in the new skills that you're using in your job compared to the job that you're coming from, those people make much more money over time, right? They maximize their career earnings. And I think if you play to some of the stereotypes and cultural kind of commonalities that Jackson was describing, and you put your head down and you work hard and you hope that you'll get noticed and fairly recognized, you may be more loyal, you may be less likely to jump for the right opportunity, and you also may be, on average, less bold in jumping to a new job that has a higher skill distance or a higher percentage of new skills. So I would say advocate for yourself for sure, invest in your sponsorship and your network internally and especially externally, and don't be afraid to jump if it's the right thing and the right opportunity.
So what I'd like to do is, before we go into the questions, this issue of the corporate DEI activities, and I think the background is this. There's been an effort over many years to try, by different people and companies, to try to address inequities, but also to make sure that people who are talented, regardless of whether it's ethnicity or otherwise, and it could be disabilities or, for example, physical disabilities, get a fair treatment in the workplace. And I think a number of years ago, after, we had the whole Floyd accident, in the Black Lives Matter, there was a huge surge in corporate DEI groups that were designed, but they were not all the same. They had different styles, different objectives, but it's the first time where they made people, very senior officers in the company, responsible for DEI. So you had people whose job was to be head of the DEI effort. Now, dialing forward, two things have happened. One is the Supreme Court ruled against at least certain aspects of affirmative action. Two, the same people who pushed that issue to the Supreme Court are now pushing that issue and suing companies. But also, to be honest, some of the companies have maybe lost some gas because they didn't get the results they wanted, or they overdid it, or whatever it may be. So I guess for my three panelists, the real question is, what's your view about this issue? Do you feel that from a legal point of view that there's any relevance for the Supreme Court ruling, on affirmative action to DEI? But the other is, what's your observation about all this confusion and rearrangement of the DEI efforts at companies? What do you think's going on, and and why?
So maybe in light of some of the recent court cases, what I've seen on a kind of private corporate level is greater reticence to track individual data. So exactly the opposite of what we just described would help, right? More granular data will help us understand where the pinch points are, where the biggest opportunities are. And yet leadership teams are now, HR teams are now increasingly nervous about tracking that data and certainly setting targets based on it. And so that will be a challenge. That doesn't stop employee resource groups from building community and connection, advocating, et cetera, but it does stop progress on some level. It's a very different, though, impact, I think, at the educational institution versus in the corporate talent pipeline that we're talking about. At educational institutions, let's just talk about for a minute, very openly and honestly, what would happen if we had race blind and gender blind admissions? Based on the scores, right, based on not knowing anything else identifiable about those candidates, we'd have a lot more Asian and East Asian people at top schools. And frankly, we'd have a lot more women. And that is just the numbers and how they play out. It would be very different, though, I think, if we did not have identifiable and data tracked gaps in the talent pipeline, right? For all of the reasons in terms of gaps in promotion rights, gaps in kind of fair pay that we've been talking about. If we don't know the data, I think some of those gaps will get bigger over time.
Yeah, I think part of this whole thing is, it actually is making corporations be more, I don't know if clean is the word, but more regimented about how they go about DEI efforts. Part of this whole thing is quotas, right? And quotas are illegal. They've always been illegal. It is not a thing that companies should do. And what it's forcing a lot of companies to better understand is why are they doing the efforts that they have been doing over the past 5 to 10 years, and forcing them to actually be more strategic about expanding their pool of talent and so on and so forth, so that they can be recruiting from the largest and most talented pool of workers that they can get, right? And that ultimately, if you kind of boil it down, the DEI effort is about providing opportunities for people who end up not getting those opportunities for whatever reason. And so the sort of backlash has actually forced companies that are staying the course be more deliberate on what they're doing. And from the things that I've heard from companies that I talk to, a lot of that is actually making them make very, and I'll say the word deliberate again, deliberate choices on what their strategy is going forward, so that they can, one, safeguard against anything that comes across their way, right? And two, get to the goals that they're setting for themselves, which is to have a more equitable workplace.
Yeah, and I have my own personal perspective is that one way that companies can move forward in a way that really produces results that are good for them, and not only good for them and also good for employees, is more to adopt more an even playing field concept. In other words, rather than do these things that appear to discriminate against one group over the other, whatever, say our objective here is to get the best person in each job. And if for whatever reason we've handicapped them because we're making someone walk through mud rather than on the sidewalk, we should try to correct that. But it's not a discrimination. It's a way of creating an even playing field. And I think that's the best way to link it to what's best for the company. Because if you believe, and I do believe, that the most talented people, if you get the most talented people in the positions of responsibility, that the company do well. If you don't believe that, then you got a problem. Then the concept of an even playing field actually can work. Right now, it's just very confusing, and they're just deathly afraid of being accused of discriminating against one group or another, which is creating a lot of, and others also. The problem is companies are not sure whether what they were doing the last 5 years was actually doing the best thing for the company's performance, right? And that's created a lot of confusion. Any comment, Jackson, on this DEI thing? I'm sure MIT, that's a hot topic, even on the academic front, right?
Yes. First, I would say I really appreciate the perspectives from all three of you. Certainly, add to my thinking. And what I can add is that from a research perspective, from a social science perspective, is a truly complex topic because different studies often show mixed findings, right? So, and people talk about the fairness perspective for DEI, but there's also the instrument or business perspective for DEI. And oftentimes, researchers find different answers, right? Where the DEI helps, on the one hand, it, for example, fosters creativity, innovation, but on the other hand, that can introduce, for example, mistrust, miscommunication, and so on, right? So diversity is always considered, or at least often considered, as a double-edged sword.
I'm going to start to read some of the questions here. So one says, from anonymous attendee, a very famous, there are a tremendous number of anonymous attendees attending these. Says, Jackie, could you please elaborate on the scarcity mindset that you referenced with the East Asian demographic?
I was actually going to do that. I saw the comment. The scarcity mindset refers to something that often happens with immigrants and or folks who are coming from a less privileged background, in the sense of there is a mindset that there's only so much you can. There's only so much in the world that you can have, and so if one person has it, then another person can't have it. The scarcity mindset actually happens quite a bit. I think about my upbringing as a first generation immigrant, and my parents telling me things like, well, if you help this other kid in school, then they're going to do better than you, and you can't, because you both can't do well, right? And that's the kind of thing that then culturally, mindset wise, kind of permeates then into the workplace, and that often tends to happen with more with East Asian, Southeast Asian folks, because of more recent, needs-based immigration rather than a skills-based immigration that South Asians tend to be.
We have a question here from Terrence Lin. Said, do you find that South Asians are more open and collaborative amongst themselves in supporting each other, in sharing information towards climbing the corporate ladder compared to Southeast Asians? And if so, why and how can we correct this? By correct this, I mean, I assume, Terrence, you don't want to drag the South Asian down. You want to raise the East Asian, but grammatically. But so I guess really the question is, is it true that they're more collaborative and supportive in sharing information, and that helps them in South Asians? And if so, what can be done among East Asians to develop those same, benefits?
I'm happy to chime in and share that actually an increasing amount of research, including our own research, would agree with your observation, right? So the idea that South Asians may be, obviously this is not a generalization, but they sometimes, or in certain organizations, they tend to be more open and collaborative among themselves. And it's to do with, for example, how they compete, right? So for example, research suggests that East Asians oftentimes, when they do compete, they tend to compete in covert ways. Whereas, for example, white Americans and Indian, South Asians, and so on, when they compete, they tend to compete more overtly, right? So therefore, if there's a lot of covert competition among, let's say, East Asians, then there can be what researchers call in-group vigilance, right? So what exactly are you trying to, are you trying to do something behind my back, and so on. So I think it's an interesting idea that deserves more scientific attention.
Peter Wong has a question. It's not a question, but it is a question, and it's actually a thoughtful one. And it says, regarding the sponsorship gap, which, Kweilin, you mentioned, would love to hear about best practices finding and developing relationships with sponsors, mentor, advocates in the workspace. Before about people comment, I want to just say this is one of the most challenging questions, because you can say, oh, you should have mentors and so forth. But the question of how you go about that in a thoughtful way is really a challenging issue. I'll just say one comment, which is make sure you think about both sides of the equation. It's not enough to say, oh, this guy's a CEO, so I'm going to make him a mentor. It's got to be a two-way street. The other person has to perceive that they benefit from the relationship with you. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. So when you're thinking about potential mentors or sponsors within your company, make sure you look at both sides of the equation, not just what your need is, but also why that person would want to be a supporter and want to share insights and so forth. But let me turn it over to the panelists here and say, what are the best practices for developing relationships, sponsors, and mentors?
I think a couple things, and others please add. One is, as you have mentors, maintaining them over time, right? Bringing up some time on your calendar to keep in touch, call them, send them a note, send them an article that made you think of them. Do stay in touch over time, because you actually develop a lot of mentors, and we don't often invest much time in maintaining them. Then the conversion often from kind of mentor to sponsor, usually through some kind of concrete in-depth work together, that takes time. And often you'll only have one, maybe two, max three sponsors at a given time. And that is, as Peter describes, very much of a two-way street. It's interesting because some of the research that we see around, both by gender and race, frankly, when we ask Asian and Asian American women, do you want to be promoted to the next level? They, in fact, want to be promoted at higher rates than their white peers. And when we ask why, typically the answer is something around, I want to be a role model for others, and I want to prove that it can be done. And so if there is some commonality, whether that is race, gender, what school you went to, background, country of origin, all of those things I think can play into kind of a natural connection for a mentor or a sponsor, and also just a natural inclination that they might have to pay it forward, help others advance, in addition to kind of working together in other relationships that may form.
Professor Liu and Jackie, any comments on this issue of what are best practices or specific things you could do to develop mentors or sponsors?
Jackie, go ahead.
The thing I'll add to that one, I'll raise my hand. The thing I'll add to what Kweilin says is just be intentional about mentors and sponsors, in the sense of, it's not just about talking to someone, right? It's like, oh, you're my mentor, I'm going to talk to you. It is actually, you need to know what your relationship is and what you're trying to get out of it, and what the other person could get, kind of in benefit from you, and be prepared, right? Prep what you are what questions you want to ask, kind of general things that you want to get out of conversations, because you only have so much time with these leaders that you're talking to, and you want to maximize that. And oftentimes the ineffectiveness of sponsorships ends up being the result of not actually being intentional about the things that you're trying to get out of the relationship.
Yeah, and I think the reference that Kweilin you made towards, how do you maintain friendships over time? I think that's a good thing to think about, because think about your friends who have close friends from college or high school, whatever, and you ask yourself, what do they do that cause that relationship to be very strong over time? And some of those will carry over to the mentor, which is you can't say hello once a year and expect, you can't say hello once a year and expect to have a friendship from college maintained, but it's for the same reason, talking to a very senior guy once a year, that may not do it. So maybe one of the things is think about how relationships in general, close relationships that are supportive and two-way, get formed to begin with, right? And I think that's probably a good place to start when you think about how you develop a sponsor or a mentor. Jackson, any comment?
Sure, I would add that I think sometimes people have trouble initiating a mentorship, right? So how exactly do I get, for example, Peter to be my mentor? So how do you do that mentally? I think one easy way to start is to ask for advice, because a lot of scientific research shows that people love giving other people advice, right? So if you ask someone for advice, then gradually the person will be in your court, because it shows that you respect them. And obviously not just ask, but really, if the advice is useful, then try to act on it. I think that could be a concrete way to start.
And show interest in the other person. I got to tell you,
Yeah.
there's no person who's been successful who doesn't want to tell their personal story. So if you're talking to someone, don't always talk about, well, what advice you give and tell them about them. Genuinely ask them about how they succeeded and the challenges they face. You'll be amazed at how often that they'll want to tell you, right? So there's still a few more, but I think we've run out of time. There are quick questions. Someone said, is this available afterwards? And the answer is it's recorded, and in a couple of days, it's going to be on the Committee 100 website. Someone asked whether the PowerPoint slides were going to be available, and Professor Liu, the answer is?
If you email me with a good reason, and if you negotiate well, maybe I'll share them.
Okay, and you want to tell them what your email address is?
So I think they can just Google and they should be able to find it.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I want to thank the three panelists. You've done a terrific job. It's an interesting topic, but I think you've shed a lot of light on the nature of the problem, but maybe what are some of the systemic and individual solutions. Again, I want to remind everyone that I think February 8th, there'll be a Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings broadcast on journalism and the news. And then we have our annual meeting and gala, which is going to be terrific, on April 19th. And we hope to see some of you there. It's in New York at the Marriott Marquis. And we expect to have somewhere around 600 people. So there'll be plenty of things that relate to this issue during the conference. So thank you again.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.